In this video, we're going to be talking about thermal regulation. Thermal means temperature. Regulation is regulation, the maintenance or change of temperature. So what we're talking about is thermoregulation for animals, how an animal can maintain its body temperature or change its body temperature. It's really important because if you think about it, why do organisms need to regulate their internal conditions? One example is for enzyme activity. When an enzyme is too cold, it doesn't function as well. But when it's too hot, the enzyme would decompose and is not going to work either. Only enzyme have a certain temperature. Every single enzyme has a certain temperature that it works the best. So having a certain body temperature is really important for enzyme and cellular activities. On the other hand, a lot of other bodily functions, how the organs coordinate with each other, also depend on body temperature. How is regulation accomplished? This is the question that we'll be answering in this video. So thermoregulation is usually done in animals only. They really need to regulate their body temperature. So insects, there's an example, insects, fish, human beings, mammals, we all need to regulate our body temperatures, but a mushroom does not need to regulate its body temperature because it's a plant. Even though body temperature is maintained in mostly all animals, there are different types of regulations, and we can categorize animals based on how an animal regulates its body temperature. There's the endotherm, and then there's the ectotherm. So in here, it tells you about ectotherm. If an animal is ectothermic, we call them thermal conformers. Conform means it's kind of the same. So a thermal conformer, an ectotherm, has about the same body temperature as the ambient temperature, which is the environmental temperature. So those are your in general terms, the cold-blooded animals. So over here it says we have the endotherms. They're able to maintain a certain temperature no matter what the environmental temperature is. Of course, when it gets too cold or too hot, an animal might die or might suffer a little bit, but the internal body temperature should be about the same as long as the environmental temperature is not too extreme. Birds and mammals are examples of endotherms. Exotherms are the cold-blooded animals. An example would be a lizard, snake. A lot of amphibians are ectotherms. Their body temperature is about the same as the environmental temperature. And we say the internal temperature conforms to ambient temperature. Thermal conformer is the ectotherm. In this graph, it shows you how a body temperature of a certain type of animal changes as the environmental temperature changes. So if you look at the x-axis, is the ambient environmental temperature, and it goes up from the left side to the right side. And then the y-axis is how the body temperature changes as the environmental temperature changes. An example given is the river otter for the endotherms. The river otter is a temperature regulator, so as you can see, the body temperature stays about the same even if the environmental temperature changes. However, for a fish, as the environmental temperature rises, the body temperature of the fish also rises with the environment. And we'll talk about what are some pros and cons for having these two types of thermal regulation strategies. Here are some examples of how an animal, whether it's an endotherm or an ectotherm, can produce at least a little bit of body heat. So even for cold-blooded animals, they still produce a little bit of body heat, but not a whole lot, not enough to keep the body temperature the same at all times. And the key here is called metabolic activity. So metabolic activity is anything from the formation of macromolecule to the breaking up of macromolecule. And when you form or break macromolecules, And when you're doing any type of cellular activity, it releases heat. So as you know from physics, if you've taken it, there is no work that can be done that's 100% efficient. There's always loss of energy during the process of doing work. So it's the same thing with cellular activities. When you're doing work, when you're doing cellular activities, there's always energy lost to heat. So as an example, on the left side of this frame, we have when we eat food, we're getting molecules in food. And when we digest and absorb those food, we have to break down those bigger molecules. And during that process, we don't absorb all of the energy that we eat. We release a whole lot of those heat, a whole lot of those energy to heat. Okay, and then the next step is after the energy is absorbed, those energy get used in the cells in our body, and those during that process, there's also the loss of heat. So cellular respiration, loss of heat, and then when we do more and more other types of cellular work, there's also loss of heat, and when we're making certain molecules within our body, making more of the macromolecules, putting amino acids together to make protein, for example, there's still loss of heat. So every single step of work being done in our body, we produce a little bit of heat. So for an endotherm, the metabolic activity is generally higher. We do a lot more of these work, and we're able to produce a lot more heat for our body. And for an ectotherm, they don't produce as much heat during, well, they still produce heat during all of these processes, but not as much in order to maintain a body temperature. So in general, endothermic organisms have a higher metabolic rate than ectothermic organisms. So you can measure metabolic activity by measuring how much oxygen intake is done within a certain amount of time, how fast you breathe. For endotherms, we breathe a lot faster, and we taking more food, and we break down those food, and we do a lot more work in general in our body in order to support the body temperature that we need. In this picture, it shows you there are 4 types of heat exchange between an organism and an environment. There's radiation, so from the sun, we can take in heat. This is mostly for ectotherms, since endotherms can do all of these even without the radiation. And then there's evaporation of sweat, water, whatever it is. There's conduction. Conduction happens between 2 solid surfaces. So if this rock is warm because of the radiation from the sun, this heat energy is able to conduct from the rock to this lizard. And then there's convection, which is when the wind blows on this lizard, it could also give it a little more heat. So these are the 4 major ways that heat exchange can be done between an organism and an environment. Because for endotherms, we have to control heat exchange, and there are several ways for us to do that. We don't want to get too hot, and we don't want to get too cold. The skin itself is a major mechanism of heat exchange between the animals and the environment. And one major way for animals, for endothermic animals, to not get too hot or too cold is through blood vessels. So organisms that live in pronounced heat sink environments, such as the ocean, utilize something called countercurrent heat exchange to decrease heat loss in extremities. So this happens in us as well, for cats, and a lot of animals have this thing called countercurrent heat exchange or countercurrent exchange. What it is that this picture shows you a little bit better. If you don't have countercurrent heat exchange, what happens is the blood vessel that sends blood to the end of a body part, is farther away from the blood vessel that comes back to the center of your body. And the result of that is you will have warmer blood coming in, but as it's going to the end of the body part, it cools down, and when it comes back, it keeps on cooling down more. However, if you have countercurrent heat exchange, the two blood vessels are much closer to each other. You would have warm blood coming in. It gets cooler and cooler as it gets to the end of the paw. However, when this blood comes back to your heart, it's going to get heated up again by the other blood vessel. So as this warmer blood coming this way and this colder blood coming this way, this warmer blood is able to heat up this colder blood because these two blood vessels are very close to each other, and this allows less heat loss. So we call this countercurrent heat exchange. So here are two more pictures showing you this is a goose, and so you can see the blood, the artery and the vein. The artery is the blood sending out, and then the vein is blood going back to the heart. The temperature of the blood is about the same on each side if they're along the same line. And then the same thing with a dolphin. The warmer blood and the warmer blood is able to heat up the cooler blood. So this decreases heat loss, which is very important. Another way that mammals can utilize our skin to maintain body temperature is along with muscular processes. So these are ways that animals, these are strategies that animals use in order to maintain the body temperature. Because if you only produce heat and you don't minimize heat loss, then you have to use a lot more energy to produce all that heat, right? So as an example in here, we have kind of a cycle of how body temperature can be maintained. So if you maintain anything, we call that homeostasis. Homeostasis, internal body temperature of approximately 36 to 38 degrees Celsius. That's for animals in general. I know, for human beings, it's about 35, 36.5 degrees Celsius. That's the normal range, but for some other animals, their body temperature might be a little bit higher. As there's a stimulus from the outside environment. If the outside environment is really hot, that sends a signal to our brain, the hypothalamus, which is the control center of many, many bodily functions. And the hypothalamus in our brain is able to send signals to other parts of the body. So when it's too hot, signals get sent to the brain, it's going to then send a signal to our skin in order to produce more sweat. And then the sweat is able to evaporate and decrease body temperature. And another strategy that's used in all endothermic animal is the blood vessels. So as it gets really hot, the blood vessels in the skin dilate. So those are blood vessels that are really close to your skin. Those blood vessels get widened so that more blood is able to flow near the skin. The reason for that is because more blood vessel is close to the skin and the skin is able to release heat, more heat is being released as more blood flow near the skin. So that's why you see some people getting really red when they get hot or if they're angry. The other cycle is if the body temperature is decreased, it also sends a signal to the hypothalamus. And the result of that is shivering. So shivering is a very inefficient type of muscle movement, which produces a lot more heat than your normal muscular processes. So that allows the body temperature to increase. And then the other kind is the constriction of blood vessel near the skin. So those blood vessels get thinner so that less blood is flowing near the skin. So the result is less heat is lost, and then the body temperature can also increase. That's why you see a person being really pale when the person is cold.